CDHI, the Critical Digital Humanities Initiative. This is a recent initiative at University of Toronto that emphasizes questions of power, social justice, and critical theory in making and analyzing digital technologies. So we have a version of DH that places accessible, anti-racist, decolonial, feminist, and queer work at its core, and which understands our current shift, our historical shift in digital technology as an opportunity for social and political transformation. So CDHI foregrounds creative praxis, co-creation, public engagement, and community-based and community-engaged research. We offer fellowships to graduate students, undergraduate students. We host postdoctoral fellows. We provide seed funding and other research support to faculty researchers. We provide training in critical DH methods and tools, and we host a wide range of events, including Dr. Christen's talk that we're all here for today. So to learn more about our work and our programming, please visit our website, dhntoronto.ca. The DHN stands for Digital Humanities Network. And for those of you on Twitter, we'd love to hear your thoughts about Professor Christen's research. And we'll be tweeting from the event. So please add your voice to the conversation. Be sure to tag us at UFTDHN or use the hashtag CDHI Talks. So we're very fortunate today to have two critical DH scholars. Dr. Kim Christen is joining us from Washington State University, and Dr. Jennifer Wemigwans from University of Toronto will be introducing Dr. Christen and hosting the Q&A. So Dr. Wemigwans, Jennifer is Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Potawatomi from the Wikmetaquang Unceded Reserve. She is an assistant professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the U of T, where she teaches in the Adult Education and Community Development graduate program. She takes pride in working to invert the conventional use of media by revealing the potential for Indigenous cultural expression and Indigenous knowledge through new technologies, education, and arts. Her book, A Digital Bundle, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge Online from 2018, explores the prospects of education and digital projects in a networked world. Currently, her work develops new pathways for digital production with a focus on the convergence between Indigenous knowledge, the arts, and education. This work supports the articulation of diverse Indigenous knowledges. Prior to joining U of T, Dr. Wemigwans produced numerous resources in deep consultation with Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders from across the Americas. She's earned a reputation for ethically translating Indigenous knowledge in ways that are deeply consultative and consented to by a wide variety and recognized group of elders and knowledge keepers. Her work in academia and online technology puts her in a unique position to tap the pulse of innovation in Indigenous education, the arts, and media. So without further ado, please allow me to turn the proceedings over to Jennifer to introduce our speaker for today.
Elspeth. Yeah, I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Kim Christen. Dr. Kim Christen is a settler scholar and is the director of the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation at Washington State University, where she is a professor and director of the Digital Technology and Culture program. Her work explores the intersections of cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, information ethics, and the use of digital technologies in and by Indigenous communities globally. She is founder of Merkutu CMS, a free and open source community access platform designed to meet the cultural heritage, curatorial, and access needs of Indigenous communities. She works with community archives, libraries, and museums to aid in the creation of ethical and sustainable heritage management systems. She is also the director of the Sustainable Heritage Network and co-director of the Local Context Initiative. Both provide practical tools and educational resources for stewarding digital cultural digital cultural heritage and supporting Indigenous communities in the management of their intellectual property. You can follow her on Twitter at Professor Christen, and her work, you can follow her work at publications and presentations, which can also be found on her website, kimchristen.com. So I'm really happy to be here today because I actually met Kim Christen back in the day, I would say somewhere around the mid-2000s, and we met at the Banff New Media Center. And around that time, I think it was either before or after launching Four Directions Teachings, and we were kind of brought together because of these Indigenous projects we were working on. And so I was super impressed with the work that Dr. Christen did on Merkutu. And then years later, of course, following the work and seeing how it was evolving, was quite taken in around the whole kerfuffle that happened around the meme "information wants to be free." So that was a very interesting, talk and a wonderful paper then that Dr. Christen wrote about speaking to Indigenous protocols and, the importance of, when we create these projects, that not all information needs to be free and accessible. And so I could really appreciate how Dr. Christen works in a way and really puts an emphasis on what it means to be in good relations. And that's important because those are Indigenous ethics. And so, and that's speaking to a care of ethics, when you think about what does it mean to be in good relations, but also that Dr. Christen took the time and takes the time to work with Indigenous communities. And so I was really pleased that she could come here today to speak about her work, because I often get asked from students who are not Indigenous, how do I work with, Indigenous communities? How do we work with Indigenous knowledge in new technologies? And I often will say, go and have a look at Dr. Kim Christen's work. And then when you see how that work is developed and you see the way Dr. Christen positions themselves and the kinds of ways they build community and relationships, then you'll have the answers to your questions. So I'm so happy that we can gather here today and hear from Dr. Christen and really understand the many ways that this work is contributing and gifting back to Indigenous communities. So Chimigwech, Dr. Christen.
Okay, I guess that's over to me now. There we go. All right, thank you, everyone. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. All right, well, first of all, I want to thank Jennifer for the very warm introduction and for that was, if you were listening to Lauryn Hill at the beginning of this that I picked and you know what year that was and you have the original CD, then you're as old as probably when we were, as I am. And yes, I think it was the early 2000s in Banff and it was a magical moment. And I'm certainly inspired by Jennifer's work and just very humbled to be here and humbled to be working with the communities that I do. I really appreciate that generous introduction. And I also want to thank Elspeth for the invitation to present here today. And finally, I really want to thank Danielle for her kind of logistical gymnastics and efforts to bring me here virtually. It's just really no small amount of work to put these things together. So I really appreciate and recognize that seemingly invisible labor that's involved in that. So thank you, Danielle. I want to begin by saying that I'm coming today from the homelands of the Nimipu, the Nez Perce tribe, and the Palouse peoples, where I live and work as a settler scholar, and I honor their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to and stewardship of the land, the waterways, and their ancestors. I also want to acknowledge that the University of Toronto is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Obviously, because of deterritorialization and other settler colonial projects, What is today Toronto is also home to many Indigenous peoples. So there are many reasons to provide a land acknowledgement. And as I was looking at the University of Toronto's website for the proper protocols, I found several reasons listed. So this is the full text from the university's webpage about land acknowledgements. And there are several reasons that are given why we should acknowledge the land, including that it's to honor Indigenous peoples and to, quote, provide a gentle reminder of the broader perspectives that expand our understanding to encompass the longstanding rich history of the land and our privileged role in residing here, end quote. So it's of course easy for me to pick one sentence here to emphasize, and this isn't an isolated critique about a few words at all that I want to focus on, but instead what I really want to do here is pause and dig into the why. Like, why land acknowledgements? Why? It's important not to just breeze past these statements. So the question, why provide a land acknowledgement? They most certainly could be gentle reminders of a broader perspective. They might also function as anchors for understanding rich histories of the land. Most certainly in this case, the intended reader or viewer is a non-Indigenous person for whom a more blatant reminder might provoke perhaps other associations like territorial sovereignty or clear designations about specific territorial relationships to land today. Or they may signal ongoing dispossession by the state. So it's important for me as a settler scholar to situate not only myself, but my understanding of land and the work that land acknowledgements do. So for me, land acknowledgements must be integral parts of more holistic efforts to reframe and upend settler tactics and logics of ownership and objectification that seek to remove territoriality and relationality, not just from our scholarly endeavors, but from our everyday lives. Land acknowledgements for me are a first step towards anti-colonial practices that both name and disturb understandings of land as separate from or without relation to human, non-human, and more than human inhabitants. Land acknowledgements then must be followed by actions, policies, practices, and dialogues that center Native American, Indigenous, and First Nations knowledge systems and stewardship practices, especially in educational institutions that bear the legacies and ongoing formulations of dispossession and epistemic violences that sought to and continue to try marginalize Indigenous peoples, knowledges, and those networks of relationality. Legacies of taking and keeping are not unique to universities for sure. They are but one mechanism within settler colonial regimes that continue to recycle tactics of displacement and dispossession. But these are a shared legacy across artificial state borders and boundaries. Recognition of these histories then has to move beyond acknowledgement as honoring to provide a firm grounding in the present, where we grapple openly with how to undo these destructive research agendas, policies, practice, and extractive infrastructure that continues to displace and dispossess. And these are the planned byproducts of those colonial regimes and tactics. So as a settler scholar, I very consciously move towards what Red River Métis mischief scientist Max Liberon calls doing good relations work. I try to do that by situating both my settler positionality and my relations to land as I engage in relationships defined by and through obligations to local communities. And I'm made aware of these extended relations and their violent histories every day at Washington State University, where I work. My office is located in Morrill Hall, named for Vermont Representative Justin Morrill, who in 1861 sponsored the Morrill Act. Now, this is a piece of legislation that provided states with lands designated by the federal government as public domain lands. These lands then endow and maintain universities across the nation. So the Morrill Act was signed into law in 1862, and what we know today in the United States as land grant to universities began in earnest then. Of course, the designation of these lands as public domain lands very quickly glosses over the genocide, removal, and deterritorialization of Native peoples sanctioned by the US government. as well as the ongoing benefits to the states and universities from those original violences and dispossession. So Robert Lee and Tristan Atome from High Country News spent 2 years aggregating data from federal and state documents to map what they call land grab universities. Their work shows in fiscal and territorial detail that, quote, land grant universities were built not just on Indigenous land, but with Indigenous land, end quote. And this connection is really significant as we engage with the work and collaboration that begins after land acknowledgements, especially in universities. The data show that universities continue to reap financial benefits from the original dispossession of Indigenous lands by the federal government. In 2019, for example, Washington State University generated $4.5 million in revenue from those land holdings, mostly from timber harvest. But it doesn't end there. At the same time, our libraries, archives, museums, labs continue to extract and reap benefit from cultural and linguistic heritage materials and Indigenous intellectual property, all of which that is tied to the land. So while my example is specific to the US, the tactics of displacement, violence, and the continued financial benefits to the state from Indigenous dispossession are shared across settler colonial states and artificial boundaries. We cannot then divorce deterritorialization and its violences from the violence of colonial collecting practices, and more importantly, the afterlife of those practices when we engage in digital projects that oftentimes already seem displaced. So these extractive practices and their legacies continue to affect land and educational relations. At WSU, our land acknowledgement states in part that, quote, as an academic community, we acknowledge our responsibility to establish and maintain relationships with these tribes and Native peoples in support of tribal sovereignty and the inclusion of their voices in teaching, research, and programming. We also pledge that these relationships will consist of mutual trust, respect, and reciprocity, end quote. So in no small part then, this acknowledgement obliges me to engage in relationships that center sovereignty, reciprocity, and trust in multiple ways. So how do we, or how do I, move away from extractive methods to establishing and maintaining relationships that facilitate trust? Trust that ensures that that very first principle of Indigenous sovereignty in its many manifestations through physical territories, social systems, cultural practices, knowledge, and language will be valued and respected in tangible, practical ways. First and foremost, that means building and maintaining relationships with the Nimipu, on whose homelands WSU Pullman is located and extends into what are today the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Specifically, this has meant for me long-term partnerships with the tribe around the return of cultural heritage materials in physical and digital formats. But before we begin any project, the relationship begins with listening. So over several years prior to ever looking at a file, digitizing a record, or viewing collections, my colleagues and I at the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation met with community members and the Nez Perce Natural Resources Program team to learn about the significance of their territorial relations and their research agendas. So in the photo you see here, Tutlow Gregory on the left and Josiah Black Eagle Pinkham had just finished leading a group of WSU scholars, archivists, and librarians around their homelands near present-day Lapaway, Idaho. We stopped just outside the mound behind them, and they told us a coyote story related to the origins of the Nimipu people. Later, I asked Josiah about the significance of place and returning to places and telling stories.
There's a story about coyote going upriver, and he comes to groundhog, and groundhog's sitting there by the river, and she's peeling her roots, and she's got this big pile of roots, and she's peeling roots and kind of humming to herself, working busy, and she keeps throwing the peels over her shoulder like that and setting the roots aside, and coyote watches that, and he thinks, It shouldn't be like that. I should go talk to her. So he goes and he sits with her and he says, I see you're busy peeling your roots and I don't mean to interrupt, but you should probably take those root peelings back to the grounds where you were digging them. Yeah, okay, and she keeps peeling like that. Coyote goes on his way and he comes back and walking by again the second day and no change, and other than, more root peelings. And he goes, she didn't listen. All right, well, go tell her again, okay, you really should take these root peelings back to the root grounds. You don't want to leave them here piled up. And she goes, yeah, I'll get to it. I'll do it tomorrow. All right, I'll come check on you. But I'm just warning you, I'll make an example out of you if, you don't do this. Yeah. So he comes back the third day and she's still sitting there peeling roots. And so Coyote goes, she didn't listen, she didn't learn. Swatched his paws together and turned all of her root peelings into a mound. And so what the story conveys, in the mound is still there to this day, except for the Idaho Road Department took part of it out for riprap. They're putting in the highway. But that mound is still there. And the teaching is that she didn't act on this respect for origin because people were always taking roots back to the root grounds, or at least putting them back to the ground. They were intentionally buried somewhere to send them back.
Right.
And there's always this respect for where something comes from. That is a common core value for Nez Perce people. When we pass away, we're not encrypted or entombed or even embalmed. That's the tradition, is that, when you pass away, you're put in a pine box and you're sent back to the earth and the spirit goes back to where it came from. There's that separation, but they each go back to the place of origin. And I don't think that Americans really understand that. They don't understand the necessary, they don't understand why it's important to acknowledge where something comes from.
So the coyote story Josiah recounts here grounds us in a specific place. And significantly, it shows Nez Perce understandings of those relationships. And as he says, right, quote, there's always this respect for where something comes from. That's a common core value for Nez Perce people, end quote. In the story, Groundhog ignored that respect for place. And in the breach of protocol, we see a broader theoretical emphasis on the significance of origins, where something comes from, on coming home, on the significance of return to place, specific places, and the value of stories that enliven places across generations. And further, Josiah notes that Americans don't really get this. We don't get this respect for origin, respect for where something comes from. So in what follows today, I will play several audio clips from my discussions over the years with Josiah to begin to understand the respect for origin, where something comes from. Josiah is a Nez Perce tribal member. He works for the tribe's Cultural Resources Department, and he's a constant presence here at WSU in classrooms, in archives, in museums, and in the center where I work. And by centering his narratives and listening to him, my aim is to move beyond what Stolo sound scholar and artist Dylan Robinson calls hungry listening. That is, forms of settler colonial listening practices and positionalities that are starved from relations, where one listens not to hear, but to take. Robinson's intervention focuses on the structural inequities and epistemic violence built into extractive listening and hearing relationships, where settler practices actively disavow, erase, and refuse to hear Indigenous presence, knowledge, and expressions of sovereignty. Because so much of the digital humanities is about listening, whether that's to archival recordings or text, oral histories, or data collected, the digital and the humanities rub up against one another as we seek ways to listen within a structure of relationality that foregrounds obligations, reciprocity, and humility. Listening with the intent to hear differently is paramount for creating reparative structures. Here I follow Tianan Athabascan scholar Dion Million, acknowledging that, quote, story has always been practical, strategic, and restorative. Story is Indigenous theory. If these knowledges are couched in narratives, then narratives are always more than telling stories, end quote. Building with and alongside Indigenous theory, in the rest of this talk today, I invite you to listen when I play these stories and discussions. And through that, I want to propose a reparative framework for research grounded in community engagement at the intersection of digital technologies, humanities, archival sciences, and library and information studies, in order to reorient seemingly settled notions of authorship, attribution, and accountability, most fundamentally around territorial relationships and kinship. So when I spoke to Josiah about these very connections between sovereignty, collections, stewardship, homelands, and native knowledge systems, he began with this story.
One of the most powerful quotes that I've seen was by a man named Archie Finney, and he was a Nez Perce. He's the first Nez Perce to attain a level of doctorate degree, linguistics. He tediously recorded his mother telling coyote stories over the course of a summer, and then translated and put him into his I think it was his doctoral dissertation. And I'll paraphrase, but what he said is, when I look at words on a page, all I see is the corpse of what was.
Wow.
He gets it.
Yeah.
He gets how scarce and rare these moments are, how sacred they are. You know, when two people come together and they're visiting like that, how can you capture the subtle intonations and fluctuations in voice, you know, the mannerisms and the gestures and all of that with mere writing? And in those stories is his mother, his relationship with his mother. And that's all that he has. But why is that important? It's important because that relationship, even though that's the corpse, you go to it and you revivify it. You breathe life back into that by speaking it back to those around you, because that's the true place for it. The true place for it isn't here written on the paper.
Right.
It's not supposed to live in your phone. But that's the place that you go to get it, so that you can breathe it back into breathe the life back into it, because the life is the sacred nature of it is in the life between two individuals, at least two individuals.
So there's so much here in Josiah's recounting of Finney's linguistic work, recording coyote stories with his mother. And we begin to see how storytelling is this intimate relationship, relationships that extend to kin, to land, and through language, relationships that last through time and space, relationships that may seem dead but aren't. Finney's mother is in those stories, and his relationship with his mother is bound in that act of storytelling, and further in that intergenerational listening and hearing and telling and retelling. And it's that transfer between people, and it's in the recordings that one can continually return to, that, as Josiah notes, that's what's important, because that relationship, even though that's the corpse, you go to it and you revivify it. You breathe life back into that by speaking it back to those around you, end quote. So even though there's this initial impulse to see that text as corpse, what Josiah ushers forth is a new way to hear and to listen to the recordings, or to listen to the words on the page, that disrupt that notion of a disembodied, displaced text. The text needs the people, and it needs people to come back, to rehear and re-listen and speak again. Through Finney and other Nimipu elders' teachings, Josiah focuses us on the necessity of return to stories, return to words, the voices of those who may no longer be physically present. But there is a presence, and one can, as Josiah so aptly describes it, breathe life back into that. And he goes on to connect this to cultural heritage materials.
Because it's about relationship. It's about the perpetuation of the relationship. That's what's important. And a relationship is two different things. Without one, it's gone. But yet, out there in archives in Stuttgart
Yep.
are things waiting to have life breathed back into them. And this is where the life really lives, is in the relationship between the land and the people, because there's this ancient relationship that's being honed, and those fragments all play an important part in that. Because right now we're dealing with the reconnection of a heavily fragmented culture.
Right.
And every shard is important. Whether it's a digital picture, something that's sitting in archives across the country, or a material culture object in a foreign nation. I mean, these things they're crucial, and people don't really understand that because they're so busy living their life and they're constantly stimulated. I mean, there's all this stuff going on,
Yeah.
and you've got to fit that in somehow. But looking back and connecting with your past is what helps you to navigate through the hardship and the struggle and the suffering, because it doesn't matter what culture you're talking about. Somebody's struggled through something to put you there to make a choice about the continuity of that, and it all plays together: material culture, language, land relationships, ceremonies, family. Family's a big one. The raw power is in the exchange from one person to the next. And see, when I listen to those recordings, my grandfather's there with me. I mean, he's in my heart and mind. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I'm becoming him. See, that's when the connection is really broken, when you're no longer becoming your grandparents.
So we hear the strength of connections in Josiah's words. The archives contain fragments, but those fragments, or the shards, as he says, they're not devoid of power or relations. They're not disconnected from today. These are fragments of relations, of his grandfather, of recordings or material that's waiting for reconnection, waiting for to have life breathed back into them, because they play a part in today's relationship between the land and the people, for the struggles for survival. And for Josiah, it's about, quote, relationship. It's about the perpetuation of the relationship. That's what's important. His focus is on the relationships that need to be, really must be heard through Nez Perce people, relations, and territoriality. And it's not an abstract connection, but as he says, it's, quote, where life really lives is in the relationship between the land and the people. And if we recall the coyote story, it's both those specific places and the origins of cultural materials that are key to understanding their ongoing place and presence. And in these few quotes, Josiah mentions Stuttgart because there's a significant museum collection there that Nez Perce tribe has sought to repatriate. And over the last 30 years, the tribe has worked to reclaim, return, and repatriate Nez Perce materials from repositories all over the world.
And that struggle for presence is what I think the old people really understood. That's what my grandfather was talking about, is, how are you guys going to keep yourself present just here? Because like one of the oldest names for the Nez Perce that they call themselves is Kinapu. And what that means is the people of this particular place and this particular time. Kinapu, Kina, to be here. Right here, and we're the ones that are in the balance. See that term right there, again, stepping through the portal. That term, the people of this particular place and this particular time, you're in the balance of Anakonma, all the ones that come before you, and then out towards the future is Halakipu, all the ones that are unborn. So you're the ones that are entrusted with the responsibility to ensure that Kinapu are always going to be, on into the future. And we've got these things that are out there that need to come back to reinforce and, you know, put the fragments back together so that we can just keep trudging along. Because it's all about survival. That's what we're all up against, you know, as individuals, as families, as tribes, as people, governments, language, you name it.
So Josiah links this struggle for presence to one of the Nez Perce original name for themselves, the people of this particular place at this particular time. And it's that responsibility that he has to future generations of this particular place. And part of the responsibility is to return those things that are out there and that he says need to come back so that that presence can be felt and reanimated. And the cradle board you see on this slide is one of those items that has been returned. And it highlights those generational relations, both the future generations that will use a similar cradle board and the past generations who continue to teach. And reconnecting with these materials and providing a different platform for revival of those relations that were temporarily broken has been central to our joint collaborations over the last 15 years. And it's included this shift to the digital format. As part of that shift, we all had to think carefully through about what it meant for these belongings to circulate in digital formats. So in 2008, we launched the Plateau Peoples Web Portal. The portal is a collaboration not just with the Nimipu, but with 8 Native nations, WSU, federal and state and regional collecting institutions and universities. But the goal of the portal is to provide access to and control over the stewardship of cultural heritage materials to the local communities. That is, from the beginning, the project was directed by the specific needs of the tribal nations involved. Now, the portal's built on Mukurtu CMS, which is a free and open source content management system and access platform that we built here at the CDSC with Indigenous communities globally, specifically to address issues of access, attribution, and accountability within its core functionality and architecture. In fact, the Plateau Peoples Web Portal is actually the beta version of Mukurtu. I'm not going to go into Mukurtu today. I can certainly answer questions about it in the Q&A, but what I wanted to foreground are 2 features that we created in large part from the experience of working with the Plateau tribes on the portal. So the first one is community records. So what you see here, this is a digital heritage item from the portal. It's a digitized lantern slide from the Chamawa boarding school in Oregon. And you can see across the top, there are 4 records from 3 distinct tribes for this one image. Now, each of those community records then contains distinct audio recordings from elders who were there as children, textual narratives, and biographical information from different tribal members. And importantly, each one of those community records can also have its own distinct protocols for access and viewing. So users may be able to see or hear some, all, or none, depending on the permissions and roles. So community records really disrupt this notion of an authority record and displaces that non-native descriptions and discussions that often masquerade in the archives as definitive. The other function is a set of functions that we call round trip. A round trip allows metadata from communities, these community records, to be shared selectively back with institutions. So that is, tribal representatives define themselves what information they may want to return to repositories. They may want to share some extended narratives, but not traditional knowledge or not specific locations. The point being, the decision is theirs about what to share back. So the functionality really reflects the needs of the Native nations and the tribal representatives who guide the project. And further, the project is grounded in a broader memorandum of understanding between the university and 12 tribes in the Quad State region. So the university's MOU has very broad goals of strengthening relationships and improving educational opportunities. And the tribal representatives who initiated the portal project had then very specific goals of providing access to collections at WSU and other institutions to tribal community members who couldn't physically access collections, whether they're in Washington State or Washington, DC, or somewhere else. So this was really intended as a mode for digital return, but it was framed around those same obligations of physical return and territorial relationships. So significantly, it was not only return, though, of course, that the tribal representatives wanted, but that control over what was accessible, how it was presented, and more importantly, these ongoing commitments to sustain the content and metadata in ways that align with their sovereignty and cultural protocols. In short, they articulated what Hopi legal scholar Trevor Reed suggests that, quote, one of Indigenous sovereignty's core attributes must be the ability to care for the voices, likenesses, and cultural representations of our people, past, present, and future, end quote. So these belongings, like the Nimipu cradle board in this photo from the National Museum of the American Indian, are not only waiting to be returned, but Josiah and others are waiting to care for them again as part of that expression of sovereignty. And that care happens in multiple ways and modalities, none of which are mutually exclusive. The Plateau Peoples web portal takes as its starting point native sovereignty. So the Columbia River in the background was chosen by tribal representatives because all Plateau communities have relationships with and obligations to the river. But each of the 8 tribal paths signify the sovereignty of each nation. Thus, the visual and technological infrastructure matches land-based relations, whereby there are shared responsibilities and at the same time, distinct modes of care and specific local territories of relation. All of our shared work around the portal is guided by a statement of commitment that details our shared responsibilities, or a process of what I've come to call collaborative curation for the long-term management of the portal. So in these documents and workflows, we have significantly changed standard university curatorial and information management practices to reflect the specific histories, needs, and responsibilities we have as a university to the Native nations in the region. So collection selection and access is driven by each individual community. Attribution and authority are vested in the tribe or individual community members, not the university. We also ensured that the portal's infrastructure was not tied to me as an individual scholar, but to the institution. This shift is in normal research project practice is really important. Moving away from me as a PI was really key to gaining trust and making this a long-term partnership built around relationships, not research standards that vest in individuals. It was crucial that the university be a clear partner, not only to reflect the nation-to-nation governance system with the tribes, but also to underscore that this was a long-term commitment about repair, not a quick fix or a one-off project. All aspects of the portal are overseen by the Tribal Advisory Board, who determine the scope and extent of the collections we seek to have returned. A prime example is the Weku-Wheaton collection, formerly known as the Spalding-Allen collection. These materials have a somewhat common colonial history in that they were taken, sold, deposited in several repositories, but the routes and meanings of these belongings is specific to the Nez Perce, and Josiah narrates the journey and what it means.
Because I think about the journey of the Spalding-Allen collection and how, Spalding collected them and then he packed them in these barrels or crates, and they were taken by horseback down to, I think, Walla Walla, and then they were taken by horse and buggy on farther down, and then they were put on boats that went all the way around into Ohio, and they sat there almost kind of like dormant for many years, for decades, and then all of a sudden they're back on the scene, and then they're returned home on temporary loan or permanent loan, and then the Nez Perce acquire them, and that really and like I said, in a backhanded way, adds to the value of them, because that they survived that tremendous journey, and that provides a note of reassurance for the present Nez Perce that you're very resilient in what you can overcome. Look at the journey of your material culture and how it went to this far off place, and then it came home. Things are always coming home, and you count on that as a coping mechanism in some way. And it's my hope that these things that are in, like there's some martingales over in Stuttgart in Germany. There's objects in the British Museum. Those things are lying dormant, and they're probably sitting in, the stacks, and they're not being seen. They're not being shown. People aren't learning about them to the extent that they could. It's my hope that one day that those things will come back home and, again, be reunited with their kinfolk that really appreciate the spirit of that expedition. And, it's just a pretty powerful thought to know that, those things are out there, that there's potential for us to see them.
So in his narration of this, we can follow the multiple acts of taking and displacement of these belongings, and also though of their waiting for return. As he says, they're laying dormant, waiting, and it's his hope they will make that journey back home. And in fact, Wekuweten means returned after a period of captivity in English. And although the Nez Perce initially had to raise $608,000 in 1996 to buy back the collection that had been taken from them, in November 2021, the Ohio History Connection made a public statement regretting their original stance, and they returned that full $608,000 to the tribe. And in June 2021, at a ceremony in the Nez Perce National Historic Park, the Spalding Allen Collection was officially renamed. Speaking at the event, Nakia Cloud Williamson, on the right in this photo, said, quote, "The renaming of this collection is a step to reclaiming ownership. And more importantly, renaming helps us in rejecting colonialism and its impacts on our way of life," end quote. So Nakia draws a direct line from the return and renaming of the collection to undoing the effects of the colonial collecting practices that sought to break those territorial connections. Removing Spalding and Allen from the name of the collection begins to undo that afterlife of the metadata that continues to reinforce settler property regimes every time we call it by that name. Renaming then is a powerful step in centering Nez Perce attribution, that is the network of relations of which these belongings are a part. In Josiah's words, the belongings were, quote, reunited with their kinfolk, human and non-human. And Josiah grounds this return in this inherent sociality of the materials and their resiliency, the materials resiliency, the belongings resiliency, and the resiliency of the Nez Perce peoples. For Josiah, these belongings are always coming home, always coming home. They're always in that state of return. Their power and place in the community is not lost. And Josiah discusses this movement and return of both physical and digital materials and situates it within this intergenerational kin and place-based networks.
And my life journey is also about figuring out what that support network is and then passing it on. And then my sons, grandkids, they all pick it up and they say, wow, we're so fortunate, we're so blessed. This has to keep going. And that digital realm has picked up those remnant fragments that have been, deposited by the trail.
Right.
And, a song comes back, a story, a bit of language, and it reinforces that structure again. And, it's constantly being nudged and, adjusted here and there. But if you look at the references that those early trappers and traders mentioned about the Nez Perce, there's something there to be, you pull something out of there and you add to it. Because there are songs that I sing, spiritual songs, that I've come to know because of recordings. Because somebody had the presence to know this is important that I commit to this.
Yep.
I know that there's problems with it, but I'm going to commit to it anyway. And see, I face that dilemma too. And I know the nuances of it, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I'm going to do my best that I capture all of these problems and challenges that go along with the committing of that act, that I'm going to do my best to address them so that when somebody comes along and they pick this up, they'll have a little bit better understanding about why I'm doing it.
So in this statement, Josiah really peels back the layers of recording, of choices people make and how those choices are prescribed by so many factors, internal and external. And we see the effects of the history of taking and return. And he shows how it's never been easy or a risk-free proposition to record, whether it was Archie Finney and his grandmother or others. In fact, Josiah's grandfather painstakingly recorded stories and songs on a cassette recorder for years by himself, and he left them for Josiah and his siblings after he passed. It was one of the first projects we worked on together, was digitizing those cassettes only for his immediate family access. And Josiah's life journey, as he narrates it here, is following the trails of other Nez Perce people to bring some of that knowledge home. It's the gift, he says. It's in those recordings that he and others bring back, extend, and breathe life back into relations. Because even in their digital format, it's crucial that they have come back to Nimipu homelands where their kinfolk reside. And that dilemma that he mentions is that balance between knowing that relationships to place and language and between people are paramount, and at the same time recognizing that digital materials can be a part of the new landscape of connection and return home. Digital return then is sustained sets of relationships, practices, and processes that foster the return home of cultural heritage and language materials, framed by an explicit grounding in sovereignty, all kinds of sovereignty, territorial, cultural, and intellectual sovereignty. At the same time, digital return is not an end point, but it's a beginning for relationships.
And it comes from a place. It comes from a very particular place in this great world. And the people that have the heart to interpret that connection and that break are here.
It comes from a place, Josiah reminds us. And this seems like a really simple statement, but so much of academic research and scholarship is bound up in disavowing that relationship between place and knowledge, in extracting and deterritorializing knowledge. Whereas listening to Josiah, it's very clear. The people that have the heart to interpret that connection and the break are here. So what I hear in Josiah's narratives are an understanding of cultural belongings, kinship, and land relations as tied in this enduring set of responsibilities that are very local. If we move away from seeing collections as items, artifacts, recordings, or records, and shift to see them through Josiah's terms as kinfolk, what happens? If these belongings are kin in the very intimate, messy, and socially meaningful ways that we extend to humans, then we can foreground this interconnectedness and privilege territories of relation and stewardship as we work with communities on projects that involve colonial collections and data. It's in these connections that we can see what Métis scholar Zoe Todd suggests as, quote, ethical relationality, an active principle that encourages us to tend not only to our relationships to one another, but to our relationships to everything around us through time. End quote. As a settler, scholar, and ally, I can only glimpse the enormity of the responsibility for the ongoing care and stewardship of the land, the waters, and the many human, non-human, and more than human relations who sustain them. I can also not step away from my own obligations to act responsibly, with humility and in good relation to the stewards of these lands. Moving to a framework of repair, then, begins by nurturing and sustaining relationships that center Indigenous values and knowledge. That means stepping back from projects that mine data or seek to discover archival knowledges, or worse, give voice to others. The very terms we use to think and act with are fundamentally extractive and dehumanizing. Relations of repair, in contrast, are about acting within accordance to Indigenous protocols, governance structures, and systems of relationality. So what does this mean for the digital humanities? I'll start by saying I have somewhat ambivalent relationship to the field, but we could talk about that in the Q&A. Regardless, what I do know is that digital humanities, broadly conceived, is inherently interdisciplinary. And as such, I suggest that scholars have a responsibility and an obligation to interrogate the theoretical, methodological, and practical structures, systems, tools, and trajectories that we follow, that we recreate and we create as we enter into partnerships and projects that bring together technological or computational practices and platforms in conversation with humanistic questions, so that we ensure that we don't continue to perpetuate harm from the colonial roots that continue to privilege and prioritize extractive modalities. So what I sketched today is a reparative methodology. I began with land acknowledgements that located us all in specific places. And I've argued to see those spaces as embodied by overlapping sets of territorial and kin relations that include material culture, belongings, digital recordings, embodied fragments that are all part of reciprocal relations and territorial belonging that extend in multiple directions and provide models for ethical engagements and restorative practices with and through cultural heritage. For settler institutions and scholars after land acknowledgements, this means first and foremost building what I've come to think of as relationship infrastructure. That is, practices embedded in policies, workflows, and programs that enact, enliven, and engender respect and reciprocity through sovereignty to enable what Josiah identifies as, quote, where life really lives in the relationship between the land and the people, end quote. The foundation for repair and restructuring then is a relationship infrastructure that's born out in institutional priorities and commitments. Relationship infrastructures must provide modes of governance, operational policies, systematic workflows, and systems of engagement grounded in long-term commitments to Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination that can't be mitigated or dialed back by successive administrations in any given institution. They are explicit movements away from settler ownership, classification, circulation, and access towards Indigenous ways of caring, stewarding, circulating, narrating, and relating. Hopi legal scholar Trevor Reed argues that, quote, recognizing Indigenous peoples' rights to care for their ancestors' voices and other cultural data would undoubtedly require a significant shift in the way institutions conceptualize Indigenous cultural materials in their collections. From a curatable past on demand that substitutes for actual Indigenous presences and futures, to one respecting the sovereignty of contemporary Indigenous peoples and these materials' actual lives and existences, end quote. Reed here beautifully echoes Josiah's focus on the lives of these materials. Once we shift to an understanding of collections as kin, as Josiah notes, and of the inherent sociality of the territorial relations in which they circulate, we have an obligation to ensure that they go home. The talk of this title, Always Coming Home, are Josiah's words when he discussed the physical belongings coming back home in June 2020. At the same time, the photo from my opening slide and this photo are from July 2021, when Nez Perce community members rode home to recently return portions of their homelands in what is today Oregon. These territorial returns and the return of physical and digital materials are linked. They do not always happen simultaneously, but they are necessary companions. In this way, return is not a settler reward. Return is reparative for communities, and that repair is not necessarily something to be shared with settlers. Moving to reparative frameworks within settler institutions or by restructuring digital projects around coming home is really about letting go. Letting go of systems that deny Indigenous authority and attribution. Letting go of legal structures that feign neutrality and deny Indigenous stewardship. Letting go of metadata schemas that define Indigenous knowledge bluntly outside of relations. The only thing to hold on to is the centrality that Indigenous relationships to their homelands will endure. Thank you very much for listening.
Chi Miigwech, that was wonderful. You know, I wanted to just say how in listening to your talk, there's so much, it was so rich and there's so much to cover, but I'll just say this little piece about the the digital humanities and having the practice of listening. I really love that. And I think I really appreciated the hungry listening as an extractive listening. And I think it's really important because sometimes I think in the way we do pedagogy, that we forget that listening is active participation, right? And deep listening, to really listen and have a deep, active listening to Indigenous knowledge takes time. That's the heavy lifting, right? And I think that very few people actually understand the cultural signifiers, understand the kind of ontologies that Indigenous knowledge is introducing, and therefore, don't really, they haven't taken that time. They haven't done that work, right? And so there is this heavy lifting to do. And so I just really wanted to say thank you so much for that and for those references.
No, you're welcome. So first I'll say, if you haven't read Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening, go get it, read it. It's like amazing book, just like blew my mind. It's wonderful. It's one of those books you read over and over again. And because it's exactly what you're saying here, he walks through this and relates it back to every type. I mean, this is for sound studies, which may or may not have, an impact on whatever field you're in, but it has this broader reach because there's extractive listening practices in academia, like full stop, right? And I think, and that's where, Jane Anderson and I have a piece called Slow Archives, and it's exactly that this slowness, slowing down, is really in that mode of trying to reorient our listening and hearing. And in the end, what I'm saying is letting go of this notion that collecting and getting more is what we're actually doing. But because think about any grant you apply for, you have to like, what are the outcomes? What do you get? Like, it's all about documenting the stuff. And this is really, I would say those, that his work really deeply struck a chord with me, even though I've been thinking through these things in a lot of different ways. So I appreciate your comments, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm. Miigwech. I'm going to open up the floor to see if there's any questions, feedback, comments. You can use the raised hand function or just do a shout out because we have a few Zoom panels here, so I can't always see. I also, while we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts, I also wanted to point out just how, the coyote story and the respect for the place of origins, that is so fundamental. And for me, it made me think about the Edward Benton Bane Ba, who said all creation stories are true, and how important that is, the notion of creation stories, and not just for Indigenous people, but internationally, right? What is your creation story? What is, your community informed on? What is that connection to your land? And working with Indigenous timekeepers, we hear the Kogi saying, that's how they want to engage and meet with other people, is to hear their creation stories, right? So just so much of what you said is resonating on these levels that come from Indigenous knowledge paradigms, but that again aren't really recognized within, Western concepts or European concepts, where they have basically, disavowed and rejected their creation stories because they see them as religion. Right?
Yeah.
So there's so much there.
Yeah, and I think Dion Million's work that I cited here has also been, she really makes that argument that these stories are Indigenous theory, and I think it goes a long way. And so this is the first time I've given a talk like this where probably half of it was not me speaking. And so it was really trying, and I don't know how it worked as for you as an audience, but I mean, my point was that so much of that is hidden. And myself too, like so much of that is hidden, even though it might not explicitly be hidden. Well, I thank people, I acknowledge people, I have that, but so much of the work that we do relies on that, especially in digital humanities. I mean, there's an archive of everything, and it's all about going to something and listening or reading and then interpreting it. And all of those voices get pushed back. And so I really wanted to try this where it wasn't, you know, where there was equal parts of Josiah and his voice and his Indigenous theory about return, because anything that I'm saying is building from that. Everything I'm saying is building from that. And so I do really think, I think someone in the chat, I think it was what Rupika said, she wanted to hear about my ambivalent relationship to digital humanities. And I mean, you know, I don't know how much time we have, but my work gets situated within the digital humanities, even though I've never called myself a digital humanities scholar, and sort of what I understand to be the digital humanities isn't really what my work has addressed, because my work from the beginning and the digital components of it have been this deep collaboration to disrupt the technological structures and the information structures that exist to allow this kind of research. And so I'm slightly ambivalent, because I was pretty much, the work was either ignored for a really long time, or then when it did sort of come into the digital humanities, it seemed to be at a moment of convenience. And I'm maybe that's harsh, other people would know better than I do, but yeah, I think I see a couple other hands though too. Does anybody have?
Yeah, Elspeth, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. And I have to say, Kim, I was really delighted when I went to your website and saw the term digital humanities, because I'm like, yes, I don't have to make up any excuses why we're bringing you to CDHI. So I think the ambivalence about the term is widely shared, and it's definitely kind of what we're grappling with here, a kind of almost like a lack of a term really to describe what it is that's connecting all of us who are doing this kind of work that connects data, social justice, community, public engagement, community engagement in certain ways. So if somebody comes up with a term, maybe you could just drop it in the chat. It would really help us all. But one of the things I wanted to follow up on and ask about, just to pick up on the infrastructure question, has to do with your relationship with the library and the librarians and the digital scholarship folks on the staff and library side at the university, because you know, it's a real commitment to take on such a large digital project and to allow you to step aside to do other things and do other projects. So I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit more about what that relationship is, and who's actually doing the labor behind the scenes of adding material and what have you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I've had a relationship with folks in the library since 2008, and that first began because I was building the Mukadu software, and then I gave a presentation about that, and the Native American Advisory Board to the president basically asked for what became the Plateau People's Web Portal, short version. So it was something I knew I couldn't do by myself, and at that point, like, Mukadu was this sort of baby tiny thing that was happening just in Australia with the communities I worked in. It wasn't, you know, kind of going out to be this large software platform that it is now. But so at that moment, so from probably about 2008 until 2012, it was Alex Merrill and I both started around the same time, and he is now the head of operations at the university libraries, and also the technical director for our Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation. Alex and I, and then Trevor Bond, who's Associate Dean for Digital Projects at the libraries. We started the CDSC back in 2014 because, in large part, what we wanted, the portal project had been going for about 6 or 7 years, and it came to this point where we knew that this had to be a project beyond us. We knew it couldn't be, you know, these three sort of principal people. And so we did a number of things. We we created the center, we were able to hire people to work on the project, but more importantly, we were able to create the statement of commitment and get the provost and the deans to sign on to maintaining this project and its metadata and the content for the tribal nations in perpetuity. And so that was something that we really had to work on, because I don't know if any of you have to do multiple reams of paperwork, or I suppose now it's digital, but in any case, I'm old enough that we used to carry actual like packets of paper to get signed for grants at our university. Now we just send them around and people digitally sign them. But if you've ever tried to not have a PI on a grant, the university does like literally loses its mind. It does not know what to do because it's so bound up in assigning credit. And it's like, it's super frustrating when we're trying to do this work. And so we've been peeling back those layers and those layers. This notion of relationship infrastructure is something that I've just recently been trying out, because so much of digital humanities and grants, and not just digital humanities, but I spend most of my time in information archives, library sciences, literature, and conversations, is about infrastructure. And I get it, human infrastructure, seriously important. Technological infrastructure, really important. But if we don't have this relationship infrastructure, then we cannot engage with Indigenous communities in any sustained or real way through obligations and responsibility. In any way that we have those good relations. Like we can't do it and those relationship infrastructure goes back to the slowness. So, it may take 20 years, it may take 30 years. Some of these things may never happen, but the ongoing relationship, like that I have with Josiah, or these are other people, is just the coming and going back and forth and having the relationship. We don't always talk about a project. We're not always doing a project. So to get to your other question though, we have 4 staff who work in the CDSC, Lotus Norton Whistler, Michael Wynn, Annie Tucker, 3. We used to have 4. We have 3. And then we have, we hire undergraduate time slip workers who do some of the work. A lot of the work on the metadata in the portal is graduate students. So through the CDSC, we hire 2 graduate students every year. And, they have been, I will say, in large part, done a lot of that. Mostly cleaning up of metadata, because a lot of our metadata is batch uploaded, but that's the labor behind it. So I see a couple other questions, TL and Leslie.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
Leslie, if you could go next, that would be great. And then TL, miigwech Kim, miigwech Elspeth.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Christen, not only for the talk today, but for all the work you've been doing all these years. I have to say that you really was a big bright light in my own career, because I have for many years involved with open access and open infrastructure without really critically think about the origin myth of the notion of open. And so you reminded us over and over again that open is not universally good. There's a lot of contextualizing that we need to do. So thank you for that, because that really is such an important lesson. But by and large, when we look at a lot of the infrastructural projects today in open science, open infrastructure, there are no concerns for these kind of critical undertaking. And so they tend to reinforce, as you said, those that are already privileged and powerful. And so this kind of relational infrastructure as a core to thinking about infrastructure is something that I will continue to learn from. And so thank you for that. I don't really have a question, but just want to express my appreciation because I have too many questions to be able to say it all.
No, I appreciate that. And I'll also note that I think, so there was that original sort of love affair with open, 20 years ago. And I wrote that article, Does Information Really Want to Be Free? Like in a, kind of because of that. And I was sort of famously disinvited from a Creative Commons conference because it was, yeah. In any case, that I think and then it kind of went down and people were recognizing that open is one stance. It's one way of viewing the world. It's a particular Western way of viewing the world. And I feel like we've taken a couple steps back with open data and big data, and the conversations around that this sort of notion of big data makes me bonkers, because I'm like, what's small data then? Like, why do, it's very sort of masculine and colonial. It's like bigger, better, like the big data. But I do think if you look in that, there are some of those same narratives that we were seeing with open, open access. Now it's in that. There are obviously, though, inroads into that. So Indigenous data sovereignty and the I'm going to get the name wrong, Global Alliance for Indigenous. Sorry, I'm really bad at acronyms. Super bad at acronyms. But there are inroads being made into that. So I think kind of the importance for what you're signaling, though, is to take apart any of those claims that seem to be natural and neutral. And that happens a lot when we're talking about technology particular and digital infrastructures. It just seems natural and normal to want to, every grant agency, at least in the US, wants a sustainability plan and a preservation plan. And I have to say, my preservation plan is like, they want to get rid of this material. We're deaccessioning it. We're getting rid of it. It's like, nobody wants to hear that, I also have to put a plug for Trevor Reed's article that I cited. I think I highlighted every sentence on every page. Like, it was amazing. I do have the citation was my last slide, but I didn't show it. So I'll put it in the chat because it's mind-blowing and you should all read it.
That you were thinking of GIDA, Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Yeah, I put it in the chat. Okay, TL, please. TL?
Yeah, we're coming. So I promised myself that I was not going to talk today because we are recovering from COVID and have had brain for 10 days and feel super stupid. And then today, we just found out that we got a big grant. That is like a grant that
with great thanks to both you, Dr. Christen, and you, Dr. Wimigwan.
And Leslie Chan. And really thinking collectively. And I just want to shout out to Leslie, because Leslie was on my hiring committee at the University of Toronto. And we had one of these conversations about what is open and what does this mean? And this was in 2017 after I had seen you and Jane Kim talk at Yale and talk about Mukutu. And I was like, oh, this is what we're thinking about. And we were thinking about, okay, how do we have conversations about queer and trans and feminist data protocols and how we protect our communities? How we limit information while simultaneously being public and not public, and also be in conversation with each other and take leadership from Indigenous communities that have been doing this for, not just many generations, but millennia, right? And then our conversations with Jennifer around the digital bundle, and then also thinking about the helper model. And I'll let Jennifer talk about that, Jennifer, if you're interested in talking about that. But one of the things I'm really we're continuously interested in thinking about, and I want to even in my weird COVID, slightly drunk laboratory state, is to think about this line that always rings so true to me from Linda Tuhiwai Smith's decolonizing methodologies, which is the individual as a basic social unit. And one of the things that we've been thinking about for a long time, and inspired by Tuhiwai Smith, and then also inspired by our relationships and relations with all of these scholars at U of T and so well beyond, is the individual as the basic intellectual unit, or the individual as the basic research unit. And that is just so
wrong. Yeah.
Are totally and so wrong.
Elspeth, Danielle, you can bleep this out, but so fucking wrong.
Yes.
And it's no one with a good idea has ever created that by themselves.
Right.
And one of the things that I'm wondering about in terms of you, Jennifer, and Kim, and anyone else, is to think about, okay, how do we transform our research communities, our research networks, our research norms, our understandings about rigor, to incorporate a collective understanding and collective consent and community-based relations and all of these things. And I just think about like REB panels, and I think about like intellectual rigor, and I just think about like, wouldn't it be amazing? This is one of the things that we think about all the time. It's like, wouldn't it be amazing if academic rigor was gauged on how good your relationships are?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I will say that, I mean, this is something that I, equally in different ways, rub up against and push back against and critique and try to come up with things like relationship infrastructure and really practical ways through MOUs, through creating policies. I never thought I'd be like such a policy advocate, like in grad school. I never think I ever thought about policies. Like, who thinks about policies in grad school? What the heck is it? Like, doesn't even make any sense in your life. But so much of it now is coming back to, I think at first I thought I knew how to have good relations. Like, I started working and I was really taught this, in the Aboriginal communities I worked with in Australia and then in the US. And I was seeing that, but how do we take that out and move it past the individual to the institution? That's the hard work. And that's kind of what I was talking about in that moment of displacing me as a PI is the most fundamental thing. It has to happen. And so like, even right now, we're trying to do this with Mukurtu and move it. Imagine like, what is it without me, without us? Like, where does it go from here? How is it sustained? And that's what we're trying to think of at WSU. Like, how are these relationships that I'll take this in the CDSC, like Trevor and Alex and I were just talking about this the other day. How do we ensure that these relationships are going to continue after we leave? We have the MOUs, we have the statement of commitment, we have the library and the university all committing to maintaining the data, the metadata, all of that, but that's not a relationship. I mean, it's great, but it's not a relationship. So we're working on, really kind of integrating. So like I said, Josiah's quite a presence around here, and so is Nakia. And if you look on the Plateau People's web portal, there's just so many videos and audio of them talking about the materials, because that's another way that we're trying to embody those relationships, that this project, this digital thing that you're looking at isn't about WSU. It's not about the libraries. It's not about the collections. It's about these voices and these people and their understandings. But we're thinking about doing something that I know other universities have done in different ways, which is named, not professorship, but, providing sort of positions within the university to our collaborators so that the credit, the attribution is moved from us to the community. Because the only way to do that in a box I have to check to turn in this thing, because that we call an EREX form, which I'm sure, like, it's just a grant thing, but you have to put those in there, and you can only be a collaborator if you're like at an institution. Right now, we just got this grant, and it's between, there's 13 tribes and WSU, and then 3 other institutions, and I'm losing my mind trying to get the tribes, the granting agency wants all of the tribes and everybody to sign this intellectual property agreement. And I'm like, can we just stop for a minute and look at the hypocrisy? Look at this, just look at this. This grant is all about returning collections and reassigning attribution. And you want them to sign a fucking intellectual property agreement that vests it back at, I don't even know what to do with it. Like, I clearly I don't know what to do with it. We have to bleep a lot. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And I'm thinking like, I want to like also open this up to Jennifer has this like amazing, I don't know, don't want to put you on the spot, but Jennifer has a wonderful like manifestation of research as helper in terms of a cosmology and helper methodologies. And one of the things I just want to raise is that in terms of like the kind of cross-pollination of like trans feminist and queer, Indigenous ways of thinking, and one of the things that I like, I'm not gonna like try to like navigate my system to remember exactly what this man's last name was, but this person named Joss somebody, who I'm sorry, I don't remember his last name, when I was doing the Center for Solutions to Online Violence, and I was doing these research interviews about like, how do we create anti-violence networks in our classrooms and in our research. And one of the things that he was talking about is that research is not our only fucking gift. I'm just going to be a bleeper as well. And that when we are working with communities, like the fucking data that we're collecting or the analysis that we're making is not the reciprocal thing that we are doing necessarily. Right. One of the things Joss was talking about, and Joss is talking about working with trans women of color, in particular Black trans women who are incarcerated, was talking about like his reciprocal relationship was working the phone lines and doing fundraising as a researcher, not because he is a researcher, but it was like, that's what the community needs. That's what we need from each other. And like, the community doesn't necessarily need your research. Right. The community might need something else from you. And so what does it mean to be in relation as a way of being like mutually engaged in each other's thrivance, in each other's survival, in each other's like what we need? Yeah. And that might not be the fucking policy paper that we're going to write on, you know, research protocols. And I want to kind of turn it over to Jennifer, just in case you want to add something, but I don't want to put you on the spot, but just in case, because I know you're really smart about these things.
No, miigwech for that, TL. Yeah, I guess I could just say a couple of things. So earlier today, I was actually on a panel discussion on Indigenous resistance and resurgence, reimagining Indigenous arts as education and research. And so it was really interesting because it's very unique for me as Nod Magay, a helper, to be invited to an artist panel. So this was with Vanessa Dion Fletcher, Maria Hupfield, Tanis Nielsen, and it was moderated by Ange Loff. So I felt really, honored to be on this panel, but also spent quite a bit of time talking about this conception of Nod Magay, a helper, speaking to like a collective and an Indigenous collective model and way of working with community, right? So, and I was explaining like, yeah, I have an MFA in film and video. I have the Masters of Fine Arts, but even then, and going back as far as going to an artist high school, I just never felt comfortable with that terminology. And I think it was because, you know, there was something intuitively that it didn't sit right with me. Whereas Nod Magay, a helper or one who is helping, does sit well, because that's coming from that Indigenous epistemology and coming from those kinds of paradigms of networking and working together. So I wanted to just share that, but I also wanted to point out how, you know, this is, you know, when Kim Christen was talking about, you know, we digitized the cassettes and then we just gave it to the family. That's what we're talking about. That speaks to what TL was saying, right? That it's not just extracting, it's like, well, how are you giving back? And so I think that these are really key moments. And I also just want to say that I love the whole People's Plateau web platform, because when we look at those community records, you know, the fact that you have the Yakama, and I think it was the Omatella,
yep.
Yeah, that we are, you know, in that kind of interface design, you're respecting diversity. You're not creating hierarchy. You're saying, yes, there's many, just like, you know, my colleague Jane Wolfe is here and we're looking at a Toronto mapping project. And we're seeing that, there are many threads, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so, but it doesn't mean one is more important than the other. And so this is all about this way of working in a collective, way that honors relationships. So just wanted to share that.
No, and I think that because the question about the research agendas and how we sort of move those away from a notion of that it's gaining something for the individual or it's gaining something for the university. Like, I mean, that's going back to that, what I said in the beginning, that extractive model of the land extraction is the maybe that kind of first thing, but then the extraction of intellectual property is something that's continues to be more widespread, and it's not as confronted in these discussions of land acknowledgements. And one of the reasons I wanted to pause on that was to connect those two things, because the universities are still gaining from the original land dispossession and financially, but we're also continuing to gain reputation and degrees and everything from that intellectual property. So how do we move away from that? And the first thing has to be for grad students, that research questions have to be fundamentally rethought, because a research question is supposed to come like somehow divinely to us, right? As a graduate student, we come up with this research question, we come up with these, and which theoretical paradigms to follow, et cetera, et cetera. How do we move from that to working collaboratively with a community to follow their agendas? Right. And so it has to be a fundamental rethinking of what's that initial mode that we're teaching graduate students when they're and then when we are creating research agendas. And I think one of my original problems with being inserted into the digital humanities like 20 years ago was that I thought most of the tools that were being created were for scholars. And it was text mining, and it was literature this, and it was going back, and it was all directed at scholars, scholars to use it, scholars to create this. And there wasn't a lot of engagement with actual communities, right? The communities of practice, whoever those communities are, and however they define themselves. So I do think that, we have to think of how we position ourselves. And I'm not sure that research is the right word for us to be using, because research has such that extractive lineage, and it's tied to the colonial expedition. It's tied to colonial practices, particularly in archives, libraries, and museums. The colonial collecting practice was, that was the reason for being. So the materials that we're using and engaging in universities, in digital humanities projects, all have the stain of those colonial collecting relationships. And so if we don't call those out from the beginning, we can't engage in those more meaningful relationships with the community, because at the end of the day, maybe we're not seeing them. Maybe we spend 10 years on this project, and what do we have to show for it is the relationship. There's a lot, there's a lot of things that you can't point to see on the Plateau People's Web Portal or on other projects that I've worked on with the Passamaquoddy Nation in Maine or others, because that stuff is for them. So we don't see it. And research is about that, seeing, and then other people have to verify it or read it. And I think it really goes back to undoing that very paradigm, that what we do that is of primary importance is research, instead of what we do as primary importance is build relationships.
And, I think that one of the things that we're listening to what you're saying, and this came up in the panel earlier today when I was talking, was that, so what is the advantage of being in the university? And I can tell you that I tried to work and do this kind of community digital, service work, prior to coming into academia. And I could not get funded from the Ontario Media Development Corporation. I could not get funded from Telefilm because they weren't interested in funding Indigenous knowledge projects, because there's not much of a return on investment for that. They wanted splashy entertainment projects, right? But then I looked around and we don't have a single funding body in Canada. Like I would think the perfect fit would be Canadian Heritage, but they do not fund Indigenous knowledge projects, right? They do one-offs. And so it's very hard to go back and, we have thousands of teachings. We have a scope to do thousands of projects. And so, that there isn't the resources out there. So then coming into the university, it was like, oh, wait, there's SSHRC and there's this and there's that. But with this one small caveat, they don't want to just see you create the projects and work with community. They want to see the research question and what you're mining and taking out. So that's the one caveat. That's the one drawback. That's the one thing where you're always kind of juggling then between, oh, okay, so I want to be in service to community, but I have to do this, right?
I will say what we've just in the last 2 years here at WSU, there's been a shift, which I'm very thankful for, especially for new faculty that are coming in. Community engaged research and community engaged scholarship is now a recognized category in tenure and promotion. And this is huge. This is huge. Those of you, I don't know if you have an equivalent of tenure and promotion in Canada. I suppose I should know, but I don't. But for scholars here to move on, it was, oh, you do. Okay, good. So community engaged research is valued and valuable. And so it is moving towards that paradigm of slow. It's allowing the slowness. So in our College of Arts and Sciences and our TMP documents, it clearly says that these relationships may take years, like that 6-year tenure clock. It might take you that long just to get those relationships started and going in such a way. And that is okay. That counts now. And that's like huge. I had to, it certainly wasn't there for me when I was going up for tenure and promotion like 14 years ago. So it's kind of amazing that it is now, and that it's from the university, wide. It's not just in one of the colleges, not just one of the units. So I will say, I think that is a significant change. The other thing is, on your review committee for tenure and promotion, you can also have community experts. So normally it has to be like somebody with a PhD, a scholar. You can now have, so let's say I could have like Nakia or Josiah, like if I was going up for promotion, like they could be on my external review committee, because that's the community that I'm working with. So they're best to judge my work and my community engaged scholarship. So I think that those are huge movements within the university that have taken a lot of people a lot of time. And it's, projects like ours that have been going on, but we have our native programs is great. Zoe High Eagle Strong is our tribal liaison to the president or the provost office. And she just works tirelessly. I don't even know how she ever sleeps or when she ever sleeps. But we've just passed what's called Executive Policy 41, which it obliges all faculty in the university to be in consultative and collaborative relationships with Native communities. So if you're going to enter into any kind of project in the university, you have a university affiliation, you have to follow these protocols. It's now an executive policy. So I will say, in the 17 years I've been here at WSU, these are changes that are, and this is kind of what I was talking about today. It's not just like me doing the right thing, right? It's like obliging people into that, because I know from my work and from being in relationships in communities that there's, part of those relationships are also about those obligations and the relationships that you continue regardless of if you're doing a specific project. Like those relationships and those obligations continue outside of that project. I think that's what some of these policies and structures that we now have in place are recognizing that and also encouraging it. So.
TL?
I don't want to monopolize. So if anyone else has like another trajectory of thought, I would be very happy for that to happen. But one of the things that I'm also thinking about is like, is that one of the things that we are perpetually in kind of thrall to is like tenure and review. And in Canada, we have PTR, which is progress through the ranks, which is like our raises every year and our meritorious increments and those kinds of things. But I'm also thinking about like, so we're constantly trying to think about like, how do we make this legible to research communities? And I think that those are important questions, but that our job as researchers also has to be like, how do we make this legible to, like Jennifer was saying, like to arts granting bodies and to, other bodies and to like, and like, I'm thinking in Canada in terms of like, nation building work in Indigenous communities, and like not that a nation that engages with like academic research should get more money than a nation that's like fuck you researchers, but I think that one of the things that we continually get preoccupied by is like, how do we make this legible to the university? And I would actually propose that that is actually the least important question. Like, I think it's important for us as researchers who want to be in good relation and like have meaningful relationships and friendships to like build those things for ourselves and to have meaningful research. But then I also just think about like, what if our questions were not about how do we translate this to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada? Kim, I'm doing that for you.
Sure. I've been on SHRC review panels. I know about SHRC. It was one of the best dinners I ever had.
How do we translate this to SHRC? How do we not translate this to partnership research grants? But like, how do, like, I don't want research to be rewarded per se, but if it is going to happen, like, how do we make it meaningful in the context of like, I keep thinking about, I was on a crip studies thing where Eli Claire said, I don't want a disability scholarship or a crip scholarship that gets people tenure. I want a crip scholarship that gets people housing. That's right. What I want for this kind of scholarship, relational scholarship. I want a relational scholarship that creates an impossibility of a boil water advisory. I want a research that creates a complete moral majority against the kinds of toxification that happens through the oil sands. Like, how do we as researchers create a moral majority that actually influences policy that makes the pipeline completely not even a possible thought?
Well, I will say,
like, how do we do these things?
I mean, but it is one of those things where the policies have to change at the university level. Like, they have to, because until tenure and promotion and other guidelines and policies change, then you can't really get people out of those precarious positions that they're in, either under-resourced or they're not gonna, be maintained in the university. So that's why I said before, like, I didn't really ever think I would be so interested in policy, but I really do think that the policies within the institutions are one. The other is the granting bodies. And I will say, at least here in the US, there's been a shift that I have seen in the last 4 or 5 years, that there is this movement to understanding community practice, community archives, community engagement, and significantly, it's moved away from where it used to be, which is just, non-Indigenous or non-people of color scholars could go and say, like, this is my area of research, to now actually having to document and show that engagement, that it can't be performative. Oh, you know, we have one person on the advisory board, or, oh, you know, this, that it's actually that type of community engagement and community scholarship is what is going to lead you to get the funding. Now, this is outside, it's outside of my area to know if that's happening in the sciences, because I'm not, you know, like in those circles necessarily, so I don't know. I will say though, in the arts and humanities, at least in the US, there's been some pretty significant changes in the federal granting agencies where now they're recognizing that. But the university, or at least the university structure in the US, is sort of parasitic, right, on scholars that have these really temporary positions. So the problem is, you know, if there's people like myself who have tenure and who are a full professor, like it's less precarious for me to do and say these things than for, you know, a grad student or for an assistant professor or someone who's what we call like career track and who isn't on the tenure track or who's an adjunct faculty. You know, how do we, and I think this was one of the questions earlier, how do we value the labor of different types of different positionalities within the university that are all moving towards or want to move towards this community engagement? Because it can't just be from one sector. Like, it can't be from one sector. It really has to, at least from what I'm seeing, and this was, you know, one of the things I was trying to promote with the relationship infrastructure, that it's not just about cultural heritage projects. It's not just about digital humanities projects. This is about the project of the university, right? Particularly because we're a land grant university, but not only, right? Like, not only that. So I know that we're almost out of time though here too. So
I'm just going to step in for just 1 second to be like, this is awesome. And I don't know if the whole recording is going to go live, and maybe we want to cut it short just to like, maybe we don't want to cut it short, but I just want to say that this is like one of the most enlivened and generous and productive and what's the word where it's like you feel something and you want to make something, conversations that I've seen in a long time. So I just want to say that.
Elspeth in the chat. Make sure the swearing is prominent.
Well, Elspeth, you know I'm a very good swearer, but I will leave it off for now. But Kim and Jennifer, I just want to say thank you so much. And Elspeth and Danielle, I just want to say thank you for making this conversation part of our community as a way that we start to kind of think, not start, but like continue to think together about these things. I just really, really appreciate it.
yeah, and I want to say thank you to Jennifer, because I will be honest that I don't normally accept speaking invitations for digital humanities things because I'm very ambivalent. But when I talked to Jennifer the week before, she's like, oh, I put in your name for this thing. And I was like, okay, because you did. So it's about the relationship though. And I was like, if you think it's important, I will do it. So and I also want to thank all of you, because this is really a new talk, and it's an article that I'm writing. This is the basis for an article. And so I appreciate you all being the first audience to listen and hear. And you have my email address. I really truly would love feedback on the core kind of arguments in there. And the article that I'm writing does the same thing, only I have 3 Indigenous community members that I've worked with for a really long time, that I layer their voices throughout, again, trying to displace myself and reframe attribution. So, you know, selfishly, I would love to hear any comments that you all have about that, because it is after a year and a half of I didn't have COVID, but I feel like I've been in a COVID nightmare. So, and I finally felt like I could write something or say something that I haven't said before. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Miigwech, Kim, and I'm laughing because I didn't know you were so ambivalent about the digital humanities. So yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, and thank you for TL for all the wonderful prompts and discussions, and also to Elspeth for creating the space. And I feel really great about these kinds of wonderful crossovers and allyships and relationships that we're creating at U of T, you know, to have these discussions. And yeah, I think it's just super important because, you know, I think my ambivalence was, well, I do Indigenous knowledge, so does that fit with people's conceptions of data? Like, where do I go, right, with that? And it's just the same like today with the artist panel. Well, I'm not really an artist, I'm a helper, but okay, where do I go with that? Like I use my creative skills to create stuff, right, with communities. So yeah, it's kind of like, so it's important to have these discussions. And so yeah, Chimigwech to everyone for that.
Yes, thank you all. I really appreciate it. So I think, and
yeah, if it's okay, just to close us off, I'll hop in with a couple plugs as the programmer that I am. First of all, just thanks to everybody. I wanted to say that we have a feedback form, surprise to no one. So I'm sure that everyone will be just so excited to give us some great feedback on this event. But also we have our first, hopefully annual, but our first ever international Critical Digital Humanities Conference is happening at U of T in September, at which the wonderful Jennifer Wemagwans will be our opening keynote. So there's a link in the chat. The call for papers is open now until April 15th. So first finish your feedback form, then submit your abstract. We also have our final praxis workshop on media training for humanities researchers who are potentially interested in, potentially a little ambivalent about speaking in the media or public amplification of their research. So that is open. Unfortunately, that one is open to U of T researchers. But if you're a U of T researcher, please join us. And lastly, our closing big event of the season is a celebration of our emerging scholars. So we have an emerging scholars showcase on Friday, April 22nd, featuring the work of our undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral fellows. And so if you are interested in the next generation of DH researchers who are doing really exciting critical things, we hope you'll pop by. It's on Zoom and free and open to everyone. So thank you so much. Go ahead, Kim.
And I'll just say that my ambivalence isn't around what y'all are doing, which I think is very important. My ambivalence comes from a long history of what the field was. Things like this and Rupika's work and other people's work is really inspiring for where the field is going. So I'm heartened to know that y'all are at the lead.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to Kim Christen and to Jennifer Wemagwans and to everyone who's able to join us tonight and through our whole winter visiting scholar series. So get home safe as you commute from your office to your kitchen.
My office going to my house. So. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity. I hope you all have a good night. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Chimigwech. Good night.